Spring did not arrive in Hanseong all at once. It came carefully, like a kingdom testing whether softness could be trusted again. First, the stone lost its cruel winter bite. Then the inner courtyards began holding light longer in the afternoons. Then the plum trees stirred, not fully open yet, not bold enough to announce themselves, but no longer dead-looking either. The palace had survived scandal, confession, exposure, confinement, and the collapse of a hidden faction that had once shaped royal life from behind mourning silk. On the surface, order had returned. Underneath, everything had changed. Alvera Grace no longer moved through the palace like a tolerated interruption. She moved through it as law. Her office had been established beside the Eastern Archives under the king's direct seal. Her chambers, though still modest by royal standards, now carried a rank no one could touch casually. Scribes stood when she entered. Archivists no longer argued over whether her work belonged in the record. Even those who resented her had learned the palace's oldest lesson. Once something is written into structure, contempt must bow where affection once only whispered. And yet the change that mattered most to Hanseong was not legal. It was personal. The king no longer looked at her like a problem he must solve without being seen solving it. He looked at her like a man who had already made a private choice and was simply waiting for the kingdom to realize it could not unmake him. That, more than any decree, unsettled the court. Their peace began in small things. A sealed request for her review that arrived at dusk, even though the matter could easily have waited until morning. A tray of pears and chestnut rice sent to the archive rooms on afternoons when the king knew she had skipped a meal. A dawn walk through a side garden under doubled guard and impossible quiet, where neither of them spoke much, and yet the silence no longer felt like caution. It felt inhabited. Once, in the old queen's chambers, they spent an entire evening reviewing a stack of diplomatic correspondence so dull it should have put both of them to sleep. Instead, they barely touched the papers. The work became pretext, the kind they both understood too well now. He asked her about the first port she had ever seen. She asked him what kind of child he had been before the palace taught him to hide himself inside composure. He gave her a rare, dry answer. Loud, I'm told. Alvera actually laughed. By whom? My dead nurse, which is inconvenient, since she is no longer available for verification. The corner of his mouth shifted, that almost smile again, the one that always felt more dangerous than a lesser man's declarations. She looked at him then, properly, and saw what spring had begun doing to him, not softening him exactly. Men like him were not softened by seasons, but there was more visible life in him now, more moments when the hard royal architecture gave way and the man beneath it looked briefly reachable. That frightened her more than the distance ever had, because distance had rules. Tenderness had consequences. Outside those rooms, the palace kept count. It always did. Servants noticed that his routes crossed too often with hers. Ministers noticed that the king dismissed marriage recommendations unread. Senior court ladies noticed that a woman who should have remained only useful had instead become central. The city noticed, too, in the way cities notice changes in the weather long before official instruments admit them. Hanseong had once whispered her name as scandal. Now it whispered it with a different kind of hunger. What would happen, the city wanted to know, if the king did not merely protect the Black Rose, but chose her? The first real crack came in an afternoon of gold light and old paper. Alvera Grace had been working in the Eastern Records Hall with two junior copyists who were trying very hard not to look at her directly while she corrected their categorization of inherited seal patterns. The room smelled of cedar shelves and brushed ink. Outside, a breeze kept whirring at the half-open lattice, carrying in the first faint fragrance of plum bloom. The king entered without herald. The copyists dropped low at once. He ignored them. Or rather, he acknowledged them only enough to keep protocol intact, then crossed straight to Alvera's table. "I need the Chizhou trade transcripts," he said. "You read those last week." "I need them again." She looked up at him. He held her gaze one beat too long for the lie to remain convincing. Then, without the slightest shame, he added, "Outside." It was not a request. Alvera should have objected. Instead, she handed the nearest file to one of the copyists, told him to continue indexing without her, and followed the king through the side passage and into a narrow plum courtyard not yet fully claimed by spring. There were guards at both exits. Far enough not to hear, near enough to kill anyone who tried. The king stopped beneath the longest shadow of the western eave and turned toward her. The breeze lifted a loose strand near her temple and set it back down again. "You are troubled," he said. Alvera nearly smiled despite herself. "You dragged me out of an archive to tell me that?" "No," he said. "I dragged you out because you have been troubled for 3 days, and pretending competence makes it less visible." There was no point denying it. He saw too much. She folded her hands before her. "The court is moving again." "Yes." "They are preparing noble daughters." "Yes." "And you say that as though it bores you." "It does." The answer came so quickly that she actually looked at him in surprise. He noticed that too. "Did you expect uncertainty?" "No," she said honestly. "I expected caution." His face altered slightly, not colder, clearer. "I was cautious when I believed survival required caution. I have since learned that caution often only gives cowards time to arrange themselves." Alvera's heartbeat shifted. Something in the way he was looking at her had changed. The quiet of the courtyard deepened around them. He took one step closer. "Grace." He did not use her full name often, only when the moment mattered. The wind moved again through the bare branches. Far beyond the inner wall, a bell marked the hour. "I am going to say something once," he said, "and I do not wish to be interrupted by fear disguised as wisdom." Her breath caught slightly. He continued, "I do not want you hidden beside the throne." His voice remained level, but the force beneath it sharpened every word. "I do not want you protected in the margins. I do not want you written into palace life only as function." Alvera did not move. His gaze held hers. "I want you beside me." The world seemed to narrow around the sentence. The courtyard, the guards, the palace, the city, the whole brutal architecture of rank and memory. Everything seemed, for one suspended instant, to draw back and make room for the truth in his mouth. Alvera looked at him as if he had struck through stone with bare hands. "You should not say such things lightly." "Then you may be comforted," he said. "I have not said them lightly." Her throat tightened. He was close enough now that she could see the fatigue he carried beneath control. The shape of night spent thinking ahead of danger. The strange, almost frightening steadiness of a man who had moved beyond longing into decision. "I know what the court will do," he said. "I know what they will claim. Bloodline, dignity, ritual corruption, provincial unrest. Every sacred word frightened men use, when what they mean is that the world has slipped once beyond their arrangement and they wish to drag it back." Alvera's eyes stung, not from fear, from the terrible beauty of being seen and chosen so plainly by a man who understood every cost. "They will make war out of this." "Yes." "They will try to break you through me." "Yes." She swallowed. "Then why?" The question came out more softly than she meant it to. His answer came softer still. "Because I love you." No ornament, no poetry, no attempt to soften the truth into something less lethal. Just that. A king in a quiet courtyard saying the one thing the whole kingdom most feared he meant. Alvera's breath left her slowly. She had known it. Somewhere beneath everything, she had known it, but hearing it laid bare in daylight, in spring, without shield or strategy, changed the shape of her heart all over again. He looked at her for a long moment, then added, "And because I am tired of ruling, as if the only future available to me must be one chosen by men who have never once bled for the throne they advise." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, he was still there, still certain, still frighteningly calm. "What are you saying?" she asked. He did not look away. "I am saying I intend to marry you." The breeze seemed to die all at once. For one suspended second, Alvera could not answer. Not because she had no answer, because the answer in her heart had existed long before the palace could ever make room for it. She stopped, gathered herself, and tried again. "You speak as though this is simple." "No," he said. "I speak as though it is decided." That was where her control almost broke. Not from girlish delight, not from fantasy, from the force of a man loving her in the exact shape of his nature. Not uncertainly, not recklessly, but with sovereign resolve. She lowered her eyes because she had to, because if she did not, all the feeling in her face would have become dangerous. When he spoke again, his voice had gentled. "You do not have to answer today." Alvera looked up at once. "I do." That finally shook something in him. A quiet flash in his gaze. Relief, perhaps, or something close enough to it to hurt. "I love you too," she said, and there was no court left in her voice at all. "But I will not be the woman who makes you speak against your kingdom only to discover it was desire and not decision." His answer came without hesitation. "It is both, but only one of those frightens me." Something fragile and fierce moved between them then, too deep for laughter and too living for silence. He lifted one hand, slowly. She thought, for a wild, reckless second, that he would kiss her there in the courtyard and damn the consequences. Instead, he touched only the inside of her wrist. Her pulse leapt beneath his fingers. His gaze dropped briefly to the contact, then returned to her face. "I will not take what I mean to sanctify," he said quietly. "Not in shadows, not before I can honor it in daylight." The word struck straight through her, because that was what she wanted too. Not merely to be loved cleanly, fully, without theft. A breath passed, then another, and because they were both wise enough to know how dangerous even tenderness could become in open air, he stepped back. By evening, the rumor had reached the outer court. By nightfall, 3 senior ministers requested urgent audience on the matter of royal marriage. By dawn, Hanseong was whispering again. Only now it whispered something far more dangerous than scandal. The king had chosen. The court did not react with outrage first. It reacted with paperwork. That was how old power defended itself when open panic would look too revealing. By mid-morning, memorials had begun arriving at the king's desk in careful stacks tied with sober cord. They came from senior ministers, ritual scholars, genealogists, and elderly men who had survived 3 reigns by discovering that custom could be stretched or sharpened as needed, so long as no one admitted they were the one doing the stretching. None of the memorials mentioned Alvera by name in the opening lines. That would have given too much away. Instead, they spoke of sacred order, of precedent, of royal women who must be chosen with caution and verified lineage, of the need to calm the realm after recent scandal by selecting a queen from stable noble roots. By afternoon, noble daughters had begun moving through the palace like polished offerings, not yet formally presented, but visible enough to be seen. Silk hems at the edges of corridors, family names repeated more often than necessary in conversation. Invitations subtly extended to the right households, a kingdom preparing itself to fix, through marriage, what truth had unsettled. The king ignored all of it. That was what made it worse. If he had raged, the ministers would have understood the shape of the battle more easily. If he had delayed, they would have hoped. But calm refusal, quiet non-compliance, the simple returning of every proposed file unread, that unsettled them far more deeply, because it meant he was not reacting, he was preparing. Grace felt the pressure before anyone said it plainly to her. Servants who had relearned how to treat her with respect now watched her with something more guarded beneath it. Court ladies lowered their voices a fraction more sharply when she approached. Even the senior archivist, a man who had recently begun addressing her with legal exactness and no wasted feeling, could not hide the tension in his jaw when he informed her that the Office of Genealogical Purity had requested access to several sealed chronicles. "For what purpose?" Grace asked. The man did not answer directly. He only said, "When old families begin reading too eagerly, it is never for history." That evening, the king summoned her to the late queen's chambers. The room had begun to change with spring, too. Warmer light, fewer braziers, a scent of open wood and air rather than herbs and confinement. It no longer felt like a sick room or a hidden refuge. It felt like a place memory had chosen to become useful again. When Grace entered, the king was seated at the low table with 5 open memorials before him, and 1 unopened, still beneath his hand. She bowed. He did not ask her to rise immediately. Instead, he looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, and she understood at once that the court had not exhausted him yet, but it had begun to try. "At what point," he asked, "do men become convinced that repeating the same fear in different calligraphy counts as fresh thought?" Grace came closer to the table and glanced at the nearest memorial. Usually around the age they begin enjoying being agreed with. He looked up, that almost smile again. "Sit." She did. For a while they read together in companionable bitterness, which was its own form of intimacy. One memorial argued that the recent corruption revealed in the palace demanded a queen of impeccable clan standing to restore ritual confidence. Another insisted that marriage to a foreign-born woman would confuse ancestral record-keeping across generations. A third, more poisonous than the others, suggested that the throne's recent instability made it especially vulnerable to attachments formed under unusual circumstances. Grace set that one aside first. He noticed, "You dislike that phrase." "I dislike cowardice hiding behind scholarship." "So do I." The quiet between them settled deeper. At last, Grace asked the thing she had spent all day refusing to ask. "When will you tell them?" His gaze returned to hers. "When I have removed every path by which they imagine delay might still trap me." That answer, more than any open display of feeling, revealed the scale of his seriousness. He was not merely resisting the court because he loved her. He was planning the order in which to defeat its objections. Grace folded her hands together in her lap. "They will say I am unfit." "Yes." "They will say I carry no bloodline they can honor." "Yes." "They will say the throne must marry for stability." "Yes." "They will say you are endangering the realm." This time he leaned back slightly. "They say that whenever a king stops being convenient." She looked at him, then away. The room had grown too honest for easy breathing. After a long silence, she said, "If this costs you more than you expect." "No." The word came sharp enough to stop her. She lifted her eyes. He was watching her with a force she had learned to recognize as the shape of feeling held inside control. "Do not speak to me as though you are a price," he said. "I know the cost. I have counted it already." Grace's throat tightened. She had meant to be wise, generous, protective in the only way she knew. Instead, she had stepped directly into the one framing he could not bear, the idea that loving her might be an expense to be weighed like an administrative burden. She lowered her voice. "I was trying to spare you." "I know. The answer was gentler now. And I am telling you plainly that I do not wish to be spared. The room held them there for a long beat. Then Grace said, almost helplessly, "Do kings always speak this way when they mean to leave a woman no path of retreat?" He looked at her for a moment, and something living moved beneath his composure. "No," he said, "only when the woman is trying to retreat from the wrong thing." Outside, the wind lifted through the eaves. Somewhere beyond the chamber walls, footsteps crossed polished wood and passed on. The palace remained awake, full of strategy and whispers and soft, silken violence. Inside, all of it seemed farther away than it had any right to. He stood. Grace remained seated only because her body had forgotten what it was supposed to do. He came around the table slowly and stopped before her. There were still rules between them: rank, place, danger, witnesses waiting in every unseen corridor. None of that had vanished, and yet the room had become unbearably full of what both of them were not saying. He bent slightly, not enough to crowd her, only enough that his voice reached her without having to belong to the room. "I have one request." She looked up. "What?" "When the court speaks against this," he said, "do not mistake the violence of their fear for the measure of my resolve." The words entered her like flame. Grace rose then, because sitting before him suddenly felt impossible. They stood close enough that she could feel the heat of him in the dim chamber, close enough that one reckless movement would have changed the whole language of the night. He lifted a hand, stopped, started again. This time his fingers moved very lightly to the side of her face, not cupping it, not claiming more than they could survive, only brushing once at the loose strand near her temple and tucking it back where it belonged. Grace's pulse thundered so loudly she was sure he must hear it. His own breathing had changed too. For one impossible second, their faces were near enough that the whole room seemed to lean toward them. Grace's lips parted, not invitation, not fully, but not refusal either. He saw that, of course he saw it, and because he was exactly the kind of man she had come to love, disciplined even at the edge of wanting, he stopped. His forehead touched hers instead, very lightly. The contact nearly undid her. "When I kiss you," he said, voice rougher now than she had ever heard it, "it will not be in fear, not in hiding, not because I could not master myself before I gave you my name." Grace closed her eyes. It was almost unbearable, the holiness of restraint when both people understood exactly what was being restrained. She whispered, "You make waiting feel cruel." His breath touched her skin. "No," he said, "I make it honest." That was the moment she loved him most fiercely, not because he wanted her, though he did, and not because he denied it, which would have been easier to admire from a distance, because he wanted her, and still chose honor over hunger. He stepped back first, had to. If he had not, spring itself might have failed before that room did. The next morning, he informed the inner council, not dramatically, not in anger. Simply, during the final segment of State Review, after trade matters and tax allocations and provincial petitions had all been read, he said in the same voice he might have used to move troops or appoint judges, "The matter of my marriage will no longer be handled through recommendation. I will make my own selection." Silence fell across the chamber. One minister, old enough to know disaster when he heard its footsteps, said carefully, "Your Majesty?" The king did not raise his voice. "My intention is fixed." Another silence. Then the senior ritual advisor, perhaps unwilling, perhaps merely trapped by his office into asking, said, "May this council inquire as to the woman your Majesty has chosen?" The king's face did not change. "Yes," he said, "you may inquire." Every man in the room waited. Then he spoke. "Alvara Grace." By the time the meeting ended, half the palace knew. By sunset, all of Hanseong did. Once the king spoke Grace's name before his inner council, the palace lost whatever illusion of gradualness it had been clinging to. The battle became open, not in swords, not in shouted accusations. Men of that world rarely humiliated themselves with honesty so direct. Instead, opposition arrived in the correct robes, carrying legal histories, ritual objections, and long memorized forms of elegant refusal. Memorials tripled. The Ministry of Rights requested clarification on queenly qualifications with such innocent-looking precision that the malice inside it shone like a blade beneath water. The genealogical office produced 300 years of precedent concerning consort selection and lineage sanctity. Senior noble families began reviving daughters who had not been spoken of at court in months, polishing them, educating them, and moving them into the right corridors as if availability itself could still alter destiny. The city, meanwhile, became feverish. In the markets they argued whether the king had gone mad, wholly, or simply beyond the court's reach at last. In the women's quarters, they whispered that no king had ever loved a woman so dangerously and still looked so calm. In the scholars' district, they pretended the issue was ritual structure, though everyone knew the real disturbance lay elsewhere. A foreign-born woman had entered the moral center of the kingdom and refused to vanish when usefulness should have ended. Alvera Grace felt the violence of that understanding everywhere. Not open insults anymore. Those had become risky, something subtler, the kind of scrutiny meant to remind a person that law might protect her body while still denying her belonging. Noble women in the palace passed her with flawless courtesy and eyes sharpened to frost. Ritual ladies reviewed bridal archives in rooms just near enough to let her hear the rustle of pages where queens had once been selected according to rules designed by men who had never imagined someone like her as the answer to anything. And yet the king did not bend. If anything, resistance made him more deliberate. He did not slam doors. He opened records. He did not denounce the court as a whole. He separated the frightened from the malicious, the trapped from the scheming, the men hiding behind ritual from the men actively using ritual as a weapon. He assigned 3 legal scholars to hidden review of sovereign marriage powers in times of dynastic corruption. He reopened records from the reign of a lesser-known ancestor who had once bypassed competing clan factions after a succession crisis. He had Grace quietly help him trace sealed ordinances buried in the oldest state volumes, precisely the kind of work ministers forgot to fear until it was too late. That work became their strangest season of intimacy. By day, they were lawful and sharp, seated over texts that smelled of cedar dust and old state anxiety. By night, they became 2 people trying to build a future out of records written by men who would have hated them both for different reasons. Grace would read an obscure passage aloud. He would pace once, stop, then ask her to read it again. She would find an omitted line in a secondary commentary. He would look at her with that deep, startled focus that always felt like being seen beneath skin. It was during one such night, while rain moved softly against the paper windows and a single oil lamp turned the archive room gold, that they found it. Not the final solution, but the doorway. An old sovereign annotation, preserved in a legal digest too obscure for most ministers to consult unless forced, stating that where court factions had materially corrupted succession stability, the reigning monarch retained exceptional authority to issue direct marriage selection for the moral and political restoration of the throne, provided the woman selected was proven loyal to the crown and not aligned to any destabilizing noble house. Grace read the line once, then again, then looked up. The king had gone utterly still. "Do you see it?" she asked. "Yes." He came around the table, took the text from her hands himself, and read the line with the kind of silence that meant strategy was already assembling behind his eyes. "They built their own trap," he said at last. "All these years they defended themselves through purity of structure. But structure itself created an emergency clause against corruption within bloodline politics. Grace's pulse quickened. You can use it. Yes. He looked at her. And because no noble house can claim you, no house can claim I favored it. The truth of that landed hard. The thing the court most despised in her unplaceability, had become the very thing that could lawfully defeat them. For one brief moment, hope entered the room so forcefully it felt like intoxication. Then Grace ruined it. Not by intention, by love. She closed the book slowly and said, if they cannot stop you by law, they will attack somewhere else. The king's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Yes. They will turn to omen, ritual contamination, feminine influence, foreign threat. They will make you spend all your strength proving over and over that loving me is not a wound to the throne. His face changed. Grace. No, listen. She rose from the table, unable to sit beneath the weight of what she was feeling. I have watched kings destroyed more slowly than by assassination, not through one blow, through attrition, through argument made sacred, through every day becoming defense. He stood too. You think I have not seen that? I think you have. Her voice tightened, and I think I would sooner leave than become the instrument by which they grind your life into endless war. The silence that followed was immediate and brutal. Rain whispered at the windows. The lamp hissed once. He looked at her as though the floor had shifted beneath him in a way no enemy argument ever had. You would leave. It was not a question. Grace held his gaze, even with her heart hurting. If the alternative is watching them turn your reign into one long punishment for loving me, yes. He moved then, not wildly, not angrily, but fast enough that the room seemed to sharpen around him. He crossed the space between them and stopped close enough that retreat would have become a kind of surrender. Do not ever, he said, and though his voice remained low, the force in it stunned her, offer me absence, as if it were mercy. Grace stared at him. The hurt in his eyes was far worse than anger would have been. He went on, every word deliberate. I have fought men who tried to shape my childhood, bury my brother, weaken my body, and govern my future. I have survived women who called their management love. I have spent years in rooms where every concession was called prudence, until prudence began to look like a slow, elegant death. His breathing had changed. Not uncontrolled. Human. And now, when I stand at the first honest future I have chosen with my whole will, you would have me preserve myself by surrendering it? Grace's eyes burned. She had never heard him speak that nakedly of cost. No, he said, quieter now, though somehow more devastating. If you fear for me, then stand with me. Do not vanish and call it kindness. Something inside her broke open then. Not from pain exactly, but from the terrible beauty of being refused by love in the name of love itself. I was afraid, she admitted. So was I. The honesty of that disarmed her completely. He drew in a breath and let some of the force leave him. They want us divided because division is the one victory still available to them without evidence. I will not hand it to them, and neither, he said, softer now, will you? Grace nodded once. Then, because neither of them was made for half-truth after moments like that, she stepped closer and put her hand over his. Not his wrist this time. His hand. He closed his fingers around hers immediately, as though his body had recognized the rightness of it before thought could. That was all, and yet it felt more binding than many promises. The next fracture came 2 days later. A junior attendant from the bridal offices was caught moving sealed cloth inventories out of sequence. Under ordinary circumstances, it would have seemed nothing. Mere carelessness, perhaps, or the vanity politics of women's quarters, arranging ceremonial fabrics before official approval. But the king had long since stopped believing in innocent disarray around matters touching Alvera Grace. The records were seized, the attendant questioned. A hidden notation found in the margin of one inventory tally linked a set of ceremonial garments to an unapproved delivery route through an older service corridor once used by the Queen Dowager's restricted household. Grace saw the strip of paper herself. Small, folded, seemingly trivial. Enough. The king looked at it once and said, "The bridal offices are compromised." No surprise, only conclusion. The court had failed to stop the marriage with principle. Now the old poison was turning practical again. Once the king understood that the bridal offices had been touched by hostile hands, the palace changed shape again. Not visibly. That was what made it frightening. Ceremonial schedules continued. Formal courtesies remained in place. The women assigned to queenly preparations moved through their duties with exquisite precision. Silk was still measured, incense lists still copied, cosmetic boxes still inventoried and sealed in lacquered sets. From the outside, everything looked exactly as it should have. Inside, the king began dismantling the path to murder. He did it the way he did all dangerous things, quietly enough that no one could see the full pattern until it had already closed around them. Attendants were rotated, not publicly, but by invisible degree. A seamstress too closely tied to an old palace line was sent to care for a fictional illness in her household. A bridal perfumer was reassigned after a missing notation appeared in her records. The key to one preparation chamber was changed without explanation. A service corridor once used by ceremonial women was sealed for repair and guarded from the second watch onward. 3 of the king's most loyal watchers, men no one in the women's quarters knew by name, were posted under servant cover near the pavilions most likely to be used in any queen's purification rites. Alvera Grace noticed all of it, not immediately as a whole, in pieces. A familiar maid gone, a new face at the cosmetics table. A guard she had once seen only in military chambers, suddenly appearing as though by accident near the eastern bathing pavilion. The king himself reading ceremonial inventories at midnight, with the same concentration he once reserved for burial letters. One evening, she found him seated in the archive chamber with a tray of bridal incense formulas open before him. She stopped in the doorway. "That," she said, "is not royal work." He did not look up at once. "Today it is." Grace crossed the room and stood opposite him. "You think they'll use smoke?" "I think they will use whatever passes nearest the body without being questioned." He said it so evenly that a chill went through her despite the warm evening air. His gaze finally lifted to hers. The first time they tried force, the second time they tried poison disguised as courtesy. Now they are being denied law. He closed the formula list. People denied law become inventive. Grace leaned one hand against the table. "You sound as if you expect them to strike any moment." "I do." She held his gaze. "And if they do?" Something almost cold entered his face then. Not toward her, toward the future. They will fail. There was no arrogance in it, only certainty sharpened by vigilance. That certainty frightened and steadied her in equal measure. The days leading toward the formal marriage declaration became almost unbearably beautiful in proportion to the danger pressing beneath them. That was the cruelty of such stories. The closer two people came to the life they wanted, the more vivid every ordinary moment became. Alvera Grace noticed things now with painful clarity. The way the king's sleeve brushed the table when he leaned closer to read beside her, the way he always made sure someone tasted anything, brought through new hands, the way he never entered a room where she stood without first sweeping it once with his eyes as if mapping every possible threat. Once, at dusk, he took her through a side garden where the pear blossoms had just begun to open. They walked slowly, under guard and propriety, and the weight of everything yet unresolved. At the far turn of the path, where the walls shadowed the paving stones and no one could see them directly from the main court, he stopped. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. She almost smiled. "You did not bring me here to say nothing." He looked at her. "No," he said. "I brought you here because there may come a day when I no longer remember how to speak softly during the hours around us. I would like at least one evening in which I do." The honesty of that struck her more deeply than any rehearsed tenderness could have. So they stood there for a while beneath the blossoms, saying very little. Her hand rested once in his. His thumb moved once across her knuckles and stopped there as if even that slight tenderness cost him restraint. When he finally released her, it was with visible effort. "I have counted every entrance to the bridal pavilion," he said. Grace blinked. "What?" "Every window, every serving route, every storage alcove, every guard pattern." His gaze did not leave her face. "I know which roof tiles can be crossed without sound and which cannot. I know how many breaths it takes to go from the King's Hall to the Eastern preparation rooms at a full run." Grace stared at him, her heart pulling hard against her ribs. "You did all that?" "Yes. You could have assigned it." "I did. A beat. Then I checked it." The tenderness in the answer hurt more than grand declarations would have. He loved her like a strategist at war. No, more than that. He loved her enough to make strategy out of tenderness, and tenderness out of strategy until the two could no longer be separated cleanly. The attempt came 3 nights later. Not during a public rite. That would have been too messy. It came during a controlled pre-wedding preparation inside the Pavilion of White Orchids, a small women's court structure used for the cleansing and anointing rituals required before a queenly marriage could be formally sealed by the palace's inner offices. Grace had not wanted to attend without the king's written order in hand. He had insisted on that exact rule days earlier. When the order came, sealed correctly and countersigned by the chief lady of ceremonial preparations, there seemed no room left for doubt. That was what made the trap intelligent. Grace arrived under escort. 3 women waited inside. 1 senior ceremonial lady, 1 perfume attendant, 1 seamstress assigned to adjust the final underlayers beneath the formal wedding robes. Nothing looked wrong at first. The pavilion was warm with lamplight, scented faintly with sandal and plum bark. Basins had been set, white cloths folded. The inner screen stood open to admit air. And yet the instant Grace crossed the threshold, something in her tightened. Not fear exactly. Recognition, the shape of danger when it has learned to wear innocence beautifully. The senior lady bowed and offered the first tray, a prepared skin oil infused with herbs said to steady the body before ceremony. Grace did not touch it. "The king ordered all preparations inspected before use," she said. "They were, my lady." "By whom?" The smallest hesitation. Too small for anyone but Grace to hear. That was enough. She stepped back at once. The senior lady's face altered first, not wildly, only by the removal of performance. The perfume attendant moved next, swift and practiced, reaching not for a blade, but for the incense stand at the far wall. A coal pan overturned. Something powdered hit the brazier and burst upward in a sudden cloud of sweet, dark smoke, far thicker than ceremonial scent should ever be. Grace turned instantly, sleeve over her mouth. Poisoned by breath. Weakening first, confusion second, collapse third. Easy to call faintness if dosage remained controlled. Easier still if a panicked attendant helped the body the rest of the way. The seamstress lunged, not with scissors, with a long fastening pin meant for robe layers, now stripped bare of cloth and sharpened enough to pierce through the neck beneath the ear in one quick ceremonial-looking motion. She never reached Grace. The side screen slammed open with such force it struck the wall. Royal guards flooded the chamber from both hidden entries at once. The senior lady screamed. The perfume attendant spun toward the back passage and ran directly into a blade point already waiting for her. The seamstress, startled only half a second too long, still managed to jerk the pin upward. But a dark sleeve caught her wrist in midair so hard the crack of bones sounded above the shouting. The king had entered first. Grace saw it through the smoke and disorder like a figure from judgment itself, dark robe, eyes like iron, one hand crushing the attacker's wrist, the other already drawing her backward out of reach before the woman fully understood she had failed. "Down!" he ordered, not to Grace, to the room. Everything exploded into motion. Guards seized the women. One stamped out the brazier. Another ripped the incense cloth from the air vent where the smoke had been directed to hold longer in the enclosed space. A physician, already waiting outside, rushed in with antidotal wash and cloth. Already waiting. Grace understood then with a shock that almost rivaled the attempt itself. He had known. Not the exact minute, perhaps, nor the exact hand, but he had known enough to place men hidden inside the walls, to stage the whole ritual with false compliance, to let the trap close only where he could break it with certainty. The senior ceremonial lady was dragged to her knees, weeping and swearing she had only followed instruction. The perfume attendant tried to bite through her own tongue before guards stopped her. The seamstress, white with pain, still glared at Grace with the kind of hatred only failed killers wear honestly. The king did not look at any of them first. He looked at Grace. "Did you breathe much?" She shook her head once. He took her chin lightly, turning her face toward the light, checking her eyes, then her hands, then the edge of her sleeve where the smoke had brushed. Only when he was sure she still stood fully in herself did he let any other feeling enter his face. It was terrible to see. Not rage. Rage would have been easier. This was something colder and deeper, the expression of a man who had prepared all his wisdom, all his vigilance, all his strength precisely to prevent this, and had still come within a single heartbeat of being too late. He gave the order without looking away from Grace. "Seal every preparation room in the inner court. No one enters or leaves the women's ceremonial offices without direct military oversight. Separate them all." Now his gaze shifted to the kneeling women, and the room itself seemed to shrink beneath it. "And if any one of them lies to buy another woman's silence, I will make the walls hear the truth instead." No one doubted him. Later, when the chamber had been cleared, and the poison catalogued, and the guilty separated, Grace found him alone beneath the covered walkway outside the pavilion. Rain had begun, fine, cold, barely visible. It darkened the wood and silvered the night without softening anything in it. He stood with one hand braced against a pillar, breathing as though the danger had passed for everyone except his own heart. Grace approached slowly. He heard her and turned. For a long second, neither spoke. Then she said the only thing that mattered first. "You knew." His face changed slightly. "I knew enough." "Enough to place guards inside the walls." "Yes." "Enough to bring a physician before the attempt." "Yes." She looked at him, then beyond him into the rain. "How long have you been expecting tonight?" He answered honestly. "Since the bridal inventory shifted." Grace closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, he was still watching her, not as king, not as commander, but as a man who had spent nights measuring doorways because the thought of losing her had become intolerable in the architecture of his mind. "I hate," she said softly, "that this is what loving me has cost you." He came one step closer. "No." The answer was immediate. "This is what protecting what is mine to protect requires." The words might have sounded possessive in another man. In him, after all he had refused to take unlawfully, they sounded like vow. Grace's breath caught. He lifted one hand and stopped it just short of her face. Even now, even here, restraint. Only when she leaned into that almost touch did his fingers finally rest lightly against her temple. They will not get a fourth chance, he said. She believed him. Not because love makes people foolish, because this love had made him frighteningly wise. By dawn, the captured evidence had been read. The ceremonial lady named a surviving advisor once attached to the Queen Dowager's restricted household. The perfume attendant broke before noon and confirmed the poisoning mixture had been prepared under cover of bridal incense corrections. The seamstress, after trying twice to die before speaking, finally gave up the final protection she had left to barter. 2 senior ritual ministers had known. Not the entire plan, perhaps. They were too careful for that. But enough to leave open the corridors through which it had moved. Enough? After the failed bridal attack, no one in the palace could pretend the dispute was merely philosophical anymore. The language of ritual purity, ancestral caution, and dignified concern collapsed under the weight of smoke, sharpened robe pins, and confessed instructions moving through ceremonial rooms. Even men who had hidden for weeks behind precedent now found themselves standing too close to murder to go on speaking like librarians. The old game, call fear scholarship, call control order, call the removal of a woman, a restoration of peace, had become harder to sustain once Grace nearly died, in the very offices tasked with preparing a queen. The king moved fast, not because he had lost control, because now control demanded speed. At first, Bell he called full court, not the inner council alone, not a private inquiry, open court, under witness, with every minister required to attend unless carried out by illness severe enough to be verified by royal physician and guard alike. The message was unmistakable. No one would watch this from a safe distance. If the kingdom meant to argue about queenship and succession and the dignity of the throne, then it would do so while standing in the same room as the evidence of what fear had become. Alvera Grace was not made to wait outside this time. She entered under royal guard and lawful standing, not as an accused woman, not as a translator merely summoned when useful, but as the scholar whose work now sat at the center of the kingdom's reckoning. The hall looked different from that vantage, less like a chamber of measured power, more like a place where men in silk were discovering, one by one, that old habits could not protect them from a king who had stopped accepting the emotional vocabulary of compromise. The ministers bowed low. The king did not sit immediately. Instead, he remained standing before the raised dais, looking down over the hall with the kind of stillness that always made people wish they had chosen honesty earlier. The court, he said, has spent many weeks telling itself this matter concerns lineage, propriety, and selection. No one moved. It does not. His voice remained level. It concerns whether the throne of Hanseong will continue to be governed by fear disguised as custom and violence disguised as ritual care. The room sharpened all at once. Then the witnesses were brought in. The senior ceremonial lady, pale and stripped of all court grace. The perfume attendant, now too frightened even to lift her eyes. The records officer who had passed altered bridal inventories through the old restricted corridor. And finally, one of the ritual ministers named by the seamstress under examination. He looked half dead already. One by one, under royal questioning and in the presence of copied records, they broke, not nobly, not all at once, but enough. Enough to establish that the bridal offices had been knowingly compromised, that restricted passages once attached to the Queen Dowager's old household had been reopened through clerical manipulation, that ceremonial materials had been altered after inspection, that 2 ministers, one of rights, one of inner household oversight, had allowed delay and procedural ambiguity precisely where lethal access required it. No one in the hall missed what that meant. The men who had spoken most loudly of dignity had preserved in practice the corridor through which a woman could be quietly killed before marriage, and the throne left to recover through convenient grief. Grace stood motionless while the testimonies unfolded, but inside she felt everything. The old fear, the old anger, the strange piercing sorrow of watching how far respectable men would go to protect not holiness but arrangement. When the second minister finally fell to his knees and stammered that he had only wished to delay an improper union until calmer minds prevailed, the king looked at him with something close to contempt. "By smoke?" he asked. The man trembled. "By a pin at the throat beneath wedding silk?" No answer. The king's gaze moved over the entire court. "That," he said quietly, "is what the language of caution has meant in practice." The sentence stripped the room bare. Several ministers bowed their heads at once. Others went rigid, the way men do when shame arrives too publicly to deny and too late to redeem. Grace saw from the corner of her eye one elderly legal advisor close his eyes in pain, not for the union, not for the scandal, but for the fact that the court had disgraced itself so thoroughly in trying to prevent a woman it did not know how to name from becoming lawful where it feared her most. Then the king did what everyone had been dreading since the first memorials began. He stopped arguing defensively. He defined the kingdom. He descended from the dais and stood in the clear center of the hall. "In recent months," he said, "this court has uncovered hidden correspondence tied to the death of the late crown prince, evidence of the calculated weakening of a surviving branch of succession, the corruption of household authority under the Queen Dowager's seal, and now attempted murder in the bridal offices of the palace itself." His gaze moved deliberately over the ministers. "Some among you still pretend the greatest danger here is that I have chosen wrongly in love." The words entered the room like fire entering dry cloth. There it was, not hidden behind euphemism, named. "Look at what your caution has defended," he said. "Look at what your dignity has permitted. Look at the blood, the poison, the lies, the patient theft of truth, and tell me again that the throne must bow to the comfort of men who call this order." No one dared answer. The air itself seemed to hold still. Then, in that terrible, luminous silence, the king made his final move. "The royal marriage," he said, "will proceed by sovereign decree." Shock rippled through the court, though the wisest had expected it. He continued before anyone could gather enough breath to object. "Under the authority preserved for the restoration of the throne, where succession has been corrupted by factional manipulation, I invoke direct sovereign selection. Alvera Grace, special scholar of foreign scripts and court archives, proven loyal to the crown, unaligned to any destabilizing house, and indispensable in the exposure of treason against this throne, is hereby established as my chosen royal bride." Grace felt the hall sway without moving. The words were not only romantic. That was what made them so powerful. They were legal, structured, witnessed, exact. He had not asked the court to bless his feeling. He had used law to make refusal irrelevant. The chief legal advisor rose slowly. No one breathed. He bowed once, deeply enough to signal more than mere protocol. "The decree," he said, after one visible moment of swallowing the historical weight of what he was about to confirm, "rests within sovereign right." That was the hinge. Once law spoke, opposition became disobedience. Some faces in the hall hardened into bitterness, others into awe. A few, unexpectedly, softened into something almost like relief. The relief of men who had not wanted to fight this far and were grateful to be given a structure strong enough to submit to without dishonor. The king did not stop there. He named the ministers to be stripped. He reassigned the ritual offices. He broke the last remaining administrative line through which the Queen Dowager's buried power had flowed into the present. He ordered every wedding preparation henceforth placed under military, legal, and archival supervision at once. No ceremonial item would pass without triple seal. No attendant would move unsworn. No pavilion would go unguarded. No prayer for the wedding would be offered by a household not already verified. It was not merely a marriage announcement. It was the cleansing of a throne. Only then did he turn toward Grace. The hall felt it before she did. The shift from sovereign decree to something more human, though no less public. He did not reach for her. He did not soften visibly. But when he spoke, his voice altered by the smallest degree, and everyone heard the difference. "This kingdom has tried to make your presence into a problem," he said. "It will now learn to call it what it is." Grace's chest tightened. He continued before all of them. Courage, loyalty, truth brought where men preferred darkness, and the woman I have chosen to build the future with. No one in that room would forget the sentence. Not because it was sentimental, because it was sovereign and intimate at once, spoken with the kind of control that made feelings seem more powerful, not less. By sunset, the bells went out across Hanseong. The wedding date had been set. 7 days. 7 days until the Black Rose of Hanseong would walk not through rumor, but through royal ceremony. The city exploded. Women in the market cried openly, or cursed the heavens, or bought white thread as if weddings anywhere might bless them by association. Men argued law in taverns, with the stupidity of those who believed they had invented the arguments themselves. Scholars pretended the real issue remained precedent, though now they were reading the restored sovereign clause with shaking fingers and discovering that history had quietly made room for the very thing they found most unsettling. Children ran through alleys repeating the phrase they had heard from their mothers' mouths: "The king would not bow." The 7 days before the wedding passed both too quickly and too slowly. That is what happens when a life is about to divide cleanly in two: before and after, waiting and arrival, longing and law. The palace did not sleep much that week. Too many preparations, too many seals, too many eyes on every corridor, every ceremonial table, every robe fold and lacquered box. The old bridal offices had been half cleansed and half rebuilt under direct royal supervision. Women who had served 3 queens moved like ghosts of memory through the halls, correcting younger hands, tightening rituals, adjusting posture, explaining which veils carried what meaning, and which step in the approach to the ceremonial platform mattered more than most kings ever understood. Grace was measured, wrapped, instructed, watched, blessed, and left alone only in fragments. But the fragments mattered. In one of them, on the 3rd night before the ceremony, she was brought to the late queen's chambers. The room was lit softly. No physician's bowls there now. No signs of illness. Only lamplight, folded silks, and the kind of old calm that comes when a room has stopped being a hiding place and become part of a future. The king stood near the window. When Grace entered, he turned and looked at her in a way that made every court lesson she had ever learned feel suddenly too small for what stood between them. No attendants remained inside. For a few breaths, neither spoke. Then he said, "You are tired." Grace let out a quiet breath that almost became laughter. "I am learning that queens are made from architecture and exhaustion." This time he smiled properly. Small, rare, enough to alter the whole room. He crossed to her slowly, stopped close, and reached for the edge of the instruction scroll she still held without seeming to know it. "Sit," he said. She did. So did he, across from her at the low table, as they had so many times before. The old shape of them returned for a moment. The two people who once hid inside work because wanting had been too dangerous to name. "Are you afraid?" he asked. Grace considered lying. Instead, she said, "Yes." His eyes did not leave hers. Of tomorrow? No. The answer came more quickly than she expected. Of what then? She lowered her gaze to her hands. That it will hurt you in ways I still do not understand. That even after all this, the court will not stop. That they will smile at us and wait for weakness. That one day you will look up and realize you had to spend too much of your reign defending the woman you loved. The room remained quiet after she finished. Then the king said very softly, "Look at me." She did. Whatever she expected, it was not what he gave her. Not reassurance shaped like ease, not false promises. Truth. "I will spend my reign defending whatever is worth preserving," he said, "and I have already decided you are." Grace's eyes filled before she could stop them. He noticed, of course. His hand lifted, then paused just once. The old restraint, the habit of a man who had trained himself not to take more than honor, allowed. But now they stood on the edge of law, not outside it. The next day would change the nature of every boundary between them. His thumb touched just beneath her eye and brushed away the tear. "So do not waste tonight mourning battles we have already survived," he said. "Tomorrow is not a trial." Grace let out one unsteady breath. "What is it then?" His gaze deepened. "The first day of the life I chose." That was the moment her fear loosened, not vanished, transformed. Later that same night he took her, with only 2 hidden guards and 1 lamp-bearing eunuch, far enough away to give the illusion of solitude, into the small ancestral prayer court behind the royal women's residence. There, beneath a dark sky and unopened spring branches, they stood side by side in silence before the tablets of those whose names had shaped the palace long before either of them had been born. Grace bowed, not as a subject begging entrance, as a woman about to become part of the kingdom's most dangerous memory. When they stepped back into the moonlight, he reached for her hand, fully this time. No pretext, no accidental brush. He held it once, firmly, and said, "Tomorrow I will no longer ask history to make room for you." Grace looked at him. "I will command it." She thought then, not for the first time, that love in him was unlike anything softer women wrote poems about. It was not vague, it was not decorative, it was architectural, ruthless against obstacles, gentle only where safety had been earned, the kind of love that did not bloom despite power, but forced power to tell the truth about itself. The wedding day dawned clear, not bright immediately, clear, a pale, held breath of morning over tiled roofs and courtyards washed before sunrise. Hanseong woke early. No proclamation could have kept the city from feeling it. Shopkeepers opened late. Scholars abandoned dignity long enough to position themselves in streets where royal procession sounds might carry. Women tied ribbons into children's sleeves and whispered that whether heaven approved or not, history was about to move in silk. Inside the palace, the ceremony unfolded with the terrible beauty of perfected tradition. Grace was dressed slowly, layer by layer, white under silk, red ceremonial robe, gold-threaded overgarment, hair arranged beneath the weight of queenly structure not as decoration, but as meaning. Each woman assigned to her had been verified 3 times over, each pin counted, each cosmetic mixture prepared under sworn inspection. The last surviving enemies might still hate, but they would not reach her through the machinery of the day. When the final veil was lowered, and Grace saw herself only dimly in the polished bronze mirror, she almost did not recognize the woman looking back. Not because she looked unlike herself, because at last she looked fully like the life she had been forced to become. In the king's hall, the ministers gathered in controlled rows, some faces still guarded, some resigned, some unexpectedly moved. The king stood in full ceremonial dress beneath the weight of dynastic color and royal authority, But what struck those who truly saw him was not the robe. It was the calm, not the cold calm of distance, the calm of a man whose struggle had reached its rightful door. When Grace entered, the room changed, not metaphorically, visibly. Heads lifted, breath held, silk rustled as bodies adjusted around the fact of her. This was not rumor, not the foreign scholar in archive rooms, not the accused woman beneath scrutiny, not even the legally protected Black Rose moving through the palace with the king's seal on her life. This was the woman being brought to the throne in full daylight under ritual witness and state law. The ceremony itself unfolded with sacred exactness, bows exchanged, wine cups raised, oaths spoken in the old language, offerings made. The king's voice did not tremble when he gave his vow. Grace's did not either, though her heart felt as though it carried all the bells in Hanseong inside it. There were no sudden dramatic objections. That part of the war was over. This was not a fairy tale where enemies screamed at the altar and were dragged away for spectacle. It was better. The battle had already been won where it mattered, through law, endurance, intelligence, and a love strong enough to outlast the court's imagination for cruelty. When the final rite was completed and the chief ritual officer pronounced the union sealed, a silence fell that no one had arranged. It came from recognition. The kingdom had crossed. Whether it approved or not, it had crossed. The king turned then, according to ceremony, toward the woman who was now lawfully his queen. And in that one moment before all eyes, the whole palace saw what rumor had only ever guessed at. Not hunger, not infatuation, relief. Profound, hard-won, almost reverent relief. He had reached her. He had carried her through all of it and reached her without losing her to shadow, poison, or the court's elegant appetite for erasure. The procession that followed washed through the palace like spring itself. Bells, drumbeats, silk banners, courtyard stone bright beneath the afternoon light. From beyond the outer walls came the sound of the city straining to hear, then answering when it did. An eruption, not of chaos, but of recognition made public at last. The Black Rose had become queen. That night, when every rite was complete, and every formal audience dismissed, and every congratulation endured, the palace finally gave them one room without witnesses. Not because they had never been alone before, because they had never been alone lawfully. That difference mattered. It changed the very air. The room prepared for them was warm with low lamp flame and perfumed wood, elegant without excess, the kind of chamber built for royalty and tenderness both. For a brief moment they stood inside it, not as king and protected scholar, not as sovereign, and the woman his court could not classify, but as husband and wife. Grace was the first to breathe out. A long, trembling exhale that seemed to carry months with it. The king watched her. Then, very gently, he said, "We have reached the hard part." She looked at him in disbelief. The hard part? His gaze softened in that rare, devastating way that always made it seem as though he was yielding something almost no one else in the world had ever been trusted to see. "Yes," he said, "now I must convince my wife that she may come to me without the whole kingdom listening at the door." Grace laughed then, truly laughed, and the sound broke whatever last thread of strain remained in the room. He came to her slowly, no urgency, no desperate claiming. The opposite. The patience of a man who had waited on purpose and meant the waiting to mean something all the way through to its end. When he touched her face this time, there was no pause born of prohibition, only care. "When I said I would not take what I meant to sanctify," he murmured, "I meant this." Grace's eyes searched his, and now his forehead touched hers. "Now," he said, "you are my wife." Their first kiss was not wild. That was what made it beautiful. It was full of everything that had been withheld, not starved, not denied, but protected until it could become blessing instead of theft. His hand moved to the back of her neck, as though even now he could not bear to risk carelessness. Her fingers closed in the fabric at his shoulder, as if anchoring herself to the reality of him. The kiss deepened, only because the whole story had earned it. No court, no danger, no interruption, only truth finally allowed to complete the sentence it had been writing since the South Gate. And because some things are holier when left partly veiled, the room itself seemed to draw a curtain around what followed, not to hide shame, but to protect intimacy from being diminished by too much explanation. By morning, spring had fully opened. The palace courtyard outside the queen's eastern residence was alive with plum petals. White and pale rose drifting over stone, catching in carved railings, gathering at the base of steps where attendants moved quietly and sunlight rested without apology. The city beyond the walls was still speaking, still adjusting, still learning how to place what had happened. But inside the palace, a new fact had already begun hardening into structure. Grace stepped into the courtyard later that morning, in formal but lighter robes, no longer the wedding layers, yet unmistakably transformed. The women who bowed to her now did so with something different beneath protocol. Not all affection, not all acceptance, something more important, recognition. The king joined her a short while later. No procession, no herald, only the sound of his steps on spring stone and the shift that went through the courtyard when he appeared beside his queen. He looked at her once, and the look said enough. Around them the blossoms kept falling. Light caught in their edges. Somewhere beyond the walls, Hanseong went on doing what cities do best. Arguing, praising, resenting, adapting, mythologizing. Ministers would still maneuver. Enemies would survive in smaller rooms. History would not become gentle simply because love had won one battle against it. But something irreversible had happened. What the city had first whispered as scandal, it now had to say as record. What the palace had once treated as contamination, it now housed at its center. The woman they had tried to push into rumor had crossed into law, ritual, memory, and bloodline. She was no longer merely the black rose of Hanseong. She was queen. The king stopped beneath the plum tree. He turned toward her. No court voice now. No performance. Only that rare private tone that somehow carried through the whole air around them. Hanseong first called you the black rose because it did not know what to do with what it saw. Grace held his gaze. And now? She asked. A petal settled briefly against the dark line of his sleeve. He looked at her as if there had never been a more obvious truth in the world. Now it will have to learn that the flower it feared has become the crown it cannot erase. Grace's breath caught. Then, very slowly, she smiled. Not as a survivor, not as a woman still asking whether she had truly been chosen, as someone who had crossed all the way into the life once denied her. And that was Queen Alvara Grey's story. Not with fantasy pretending politics had vanished, not with love made easier by victory, but with something better than ease. A king who did not bow, a woman who was not erased, a marriage kept honorable until it could be made holy, and a kingdom forced at last to speak her name not as rumor, but as history. The end. If you enjoy this story, please like, share with friends and loved ones, subscribe for more amazing stories to come.